Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm just going to get started with another set of slides here. That music was awesome, wasn't it? It's like peppy and happy. So yeah,
It
welcome.
surprised me. I thought maybe some tab had started playing on my browser. I was a little startled.
No, that was me. Peppy intro music. So welcome everybody to Charleston in Between, the future of scholarly communication in a ChatGPT world. I'm Leah Hines. I'm the executive director of the Charleston Hub, and I'm very, very happy that you're all here to join us today. So a little bit of background about Charleston in Between, if you've never joined us before. The idea behind it is to give us an opportunity to tackle a new or an emerging topic in libraries, information science, scholarly communication that cannot wait until the first week of November for the annual Charleston Conference. And that is also too large to be tackled in just a simple 1-hour webinar. So something that needs a deep dive and a little more attention than a webinar can offer. So this is the third iteration of Charleston in Between. We started in 2021 with a session on the acquisition of ProQuest by Clarivate. And then in last year, we had a mergers and acquisitions panel and a panel on the Ukraine conflict. And this year, we are taking a deep dive in AI over the next 2 days. We are hoping to bring more of these in-between events to you in the future and use these as a touch point for the Charleston community to continue conversations throughout the year and not just during the 1 week in November in Charleston. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping announcements. This session is being recorded and the videos will be sent to all registered attendees within the next 48 hours. And we ask that you complete a very brief, painless, quick and easy attendee evaluation at the end of the 2-day event. We'll send that out to everybody. But your feedback is super important to us and we welcome hearing your comments. Please tell us what we're doing well and how we can improve in the future. Closed caption is enabled and you can turn on captions or a live transcript by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the attendee chat, but we do ask that you use the Q&A button to ask questions for the panelists. We'll use those during the Q&A session at the end of each presentation. Speaking of the attendee chat, give it a workout here. Tell us where you're joining from. And a little over half of our registered attendees for this session utilize the group rate. So if you're watching in a classroom setting or a meeting room, let us know how many are in your group. We would love to hear from you. So please do use that attendee chat so we can say hello and just let us know where you're coming from. We have over 400 registered attendees from 400 countries outside the US. So I wanted to take a moment to give a special welcome to our international attendees, whether you're joining live or whether you're going to watch the recordings later due to the difference in time zones. We're just really happy that you're here joining us and participating. I'd like to thank our sponsors for the event, AIP Publishing, BMJ, and ProQuest TDM Studios. Thank you for supporting the event, and I hope that all of our attendees will stay tuned. Day 2, we'll have a special presentation from each of our sponsors. And now I want to say a very special thank you to Heather Staines and Gary Price, who put in a lot of work behind the scenes to organize these sessions. They'll be moderating the panels. Heather is senior consultant at Delta Think. So thank you, Heather, very much. Take it away first.
Thanks, Leah. It's great to be here today, especially with my friend Gary Price. Gary, you probably are aware, is editor for InfoDocket and the ARL's Day in Review, kind of an invaluable resource in my inbox. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Heather. It's great to be here today. Thank you and Heather. I'm sorry. Thank you and Leah and Katina for the opportunity to work on this project with you. And I'm really excited to get going.
Great. So Leah mentioned a little bit about the concept behind the in-betweens. And I'll say we're always on the lookout, as Leah mentioned. And we started kind of kicking around a little bit on notion to do something on AI earlier this year. But with the just explosive number of articles and reports about ChatGPT and different organizations releasing statements, we thought, hey, the time to do this is definitely now. So we're pleased to be able to bring this today. I want to give you a little bit of information about how today's going to be organized. If we can go to the next slide. Great. So we will first hear from our keynote speaker, Peter Brantley, and you will have an opportunity, as Leah mentioned, to ask him questions. Then I'll come back with the stakeholder perspectives roundtable discussion, and we'll tell you in just a bit who's going to be participating there. And again, we'll be doing some group discussion, but we would love to feed your Q&A into that as well. So with that, I will hand back over. Oh, I'll do the afternoon too. It's exciting. We're going to break for lunch. So we hope you will come back and join us at 1 p.m. When we hand over to Gary for AI tools to watch. We'll see some brief presentations by, I think, 5 tool creators today. And then Gary's going to kick things off with a little bit of discussion. Then we'll open it up to attendees. And we wanted to give an opportunity for some interaction in smaller groups. We do have quite a number of folks registered and attending, but we'll have, I think, 4 breakout rooms. So that will give you a little bit of an opportunity for a discussion in a smaller format. We will reconvene in the larger group at 3, do a quick report back, and close for the day. Leah will tell you a little bit at that point about what's going to be happening on day 2. And now back to Leah.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I am very happy to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. Peter Brantley, who is the Director of Online Strategy at UC Davis, will be speaking. His presentation is titled Aiding and Abetting the Machines We're Making. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for welcoming. And I want to thank everyone at Charleston and Heather and Gary for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. It certainly provided my own compulsion to do a deep dive into AI and to attempt to translate what I think I'm learning into a broader audience. So I really look forward to your questions. So I'll try to not take up the full time. I do really look forward to Q&A, and so we'll see where we can get. So I'm gonna share my screen here, and hopefully you all are seeing my slides. And I trust somebody will shout out if they're not. So I'm with the University of California, Davis, and I should note, I'm at the Coalition of Networked Information Meetings in Denver, and it's snowing outside, which you can't see, but it's definitely a change of weather from California. But I want to introduce the talk that I'm giving, Aiding and Abetting the Machines We're Making. And I hope that the title of the talk hints at some of the frustration or conflict that's beginning to emerge between humans and AI. There's a dialogue that's emerging between the AIs that we're creating and their capabilities as they emerge and as we learn about them. And I think it's really important for us to understand and to grapple with those conflicts and those opportunities and to take advantage of them in the most intelligent way possible. So I hope this talk will get at what some of those tensions are. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about how AIs work, and then with that level of understanding, shift into some speculation about the near to medium term future, because certainly the long-term future is certainly beyond my capacity to understand. So I think any talk on AI right now, this week, next week, and the week after has this caveat of almost anything that I say predictive is going to be wrong. Many of us are playing with ChatGPT 3.5. GPT-4 is available for integration or for subscription, but GPT-5 is being trained right now and is expected to be released by the end of the year. And there are some scientists at OpenAI, its host organization, that think it might approach what's called artificial generative intelligence. So this is getting close to truly sort of human cognitive patterns of response. So it will be very interesting to see if that's the case. And I should note, this is a human-powered presentation we did, or one of my colleagues at Davis for the heck of it, did throw the title of the talk and a summary of it into GPT-3.5, and it did a very good job of creating a general summary of what a talk on AI and libraries and publishing would look like. But I actually wanted to focus on specific issues, and so I did it by hand. So first of all, what I want to talk about is sort of the underlying technology of AIs. A lot of the current buzz, understandably, is over what are called large language models, or LLMs. And LLMs such as ChatGPT, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers, and we'll get to that, that actually means something, are based on neural networks. So very complex skeins of information that are united together. And they're created by processing very large amounts of information. And although they originally started out focusing on one kind of content or another, text or images or videos, increasingly they're multimodal. So that means that they're absorbing both textual information, image information, video, and increasingly data. And I think we'll see the importance of structured data begin to emerge as something rather significant in the weeks and months ahead. The outputs of a GPT, the kind of things that you see in a chat window, are essentially prediction-based. And they emerge based on what the AI has gathered about from the information that it has been given to harvest. What's interesting is we don't actually know how they work inside, under the hood. We don't actually know the mechanism, we don't understand the mechanism, I should say, about how they actually formulate the best predicted output for a given query. And so this is something that's a point of significant research right now. Now, generative models themselves fall into two categories. And I want to bring this up because the kind of systems that we have now may not be the systems we have in the future. There was an earlier batch of inquiry into what are called recurrent models, AI models. And in a recurrent model, predictions are based on input that's fed somewhat recursively back into the model to improve its performance. These AIs are stateful. In other words, they remember a certain amount of what happened before in terms of their training, but they're also forgetful, and they don't retain all the information that they absorbed in that long string of training. Transformative AI, such as the ones that we're working with now, work by digesting a whole amount of information all at once. You can think of it as sort of an n-dimension matrix. So they process a significant amount of text and video all at one whack and compute across that mass of information, sort of in a single run, which iterates, of course, as they are trained, but it's a very different model of computation. So all of today's models that we're seeing and interacting with in a consumer level are transformative. But it's possible that as we work with the underlying technology, we might see recurrent models, perhaps with support in silicon, to speed them up and to sort of boost their performance to a level that's more akin to what we're seeing today, or obviously surpassing what we're seeing today with transformative models. Now, LLMs themselves are comprised of two key elements, and this is also very important to have a understanding of as we work with trying to sort of match what are the capabilities of AIs with the existing kinds of applications that we work with. So LLMs are initially comprised of tokens, and tokens are all of the data that an AI ingests. So all of the text, all the words, the numbers, the video bits, those are all tokens. And then in addition to the tokens, LLMs generate what are called parameters. Now, the parameters are the adjustable values that connect those neurons or those nodes in the network. The parameters provide a bias or sort of predictive element. So the connection between these two nodes, there's a strong association. Between these two nodes, there's a weak association. Between these nodes, not so much, right? So those are the parameters that control how LLM produces output. Now, LLMs are generated through iterative training. So there's a mass ingest, but there's also, in the new models that we're seeing, a feedback of human training where queries will be generated, humans will select the best response, the LLM learns from that or modifies its parameters basically to better reflect what it has learned from those human interactions. The LLMs we're working with have billions of parameters, and they're actually at the trillion threshold and billions of tokens. And what's really interesting is that the amount of compute power that's necessary to generate LLMs of this nature is new. We just did not have the capacity to build these things previously, even a couple of years ago. These are massively computationally intensive exercises. And we don't really understand the relationship between the amount of training data and the parameters. And we can adjust the number of tokens or the amount of training data, and we can adjust the number of parameters that are generated. But we don't really understand how those interact to form a more effective AI. They don't necessarily scale linearly. And it is pretty obvious that robust, well-responding AI systems are emerging with scale. So the bigger they are, it tends to be the case that they are getting better, more accurate, more responsive. One of the things that we're watching is that asking an AI to explain its logic, how did you get to a particular response? You can see that particularly in math equations. How did you get to the understanding of this algebraic solution? What's called chain of thought, that AI being able to replicate how it arrived to a particular response seems to require over 100 billion parameters. And that's been our experience to date. So this kind of chain of thought reasoning, which is very important for LLMs, emerges at scale. Now, LLMs possess what's called a capability overhang. And past some threshold that, again, we don't really understand, LLMs show a capability of what's called emergence. And an emergence is where an LLM suddenly evinces or demonstrates new abilities that we think were previously absent. But from the feedback that it's gotten through interactions, it's continuing to adjust parameters or to make connections between nodes in the neural network. And suddenly it seems to be able to present newfold capabilities. This is really interesting and a little scary. Emergence leads to some unpredictability. And with LLMs of this scale, there's an unknown potential for potentially catastrophic risk. And as we start embedding AIs into our workflows and how we do business and in our personal lives, people are beginning to actually try to grapple with what it means for AIs to create liability. Like, who bears the liability risk for an AI? And that's a very complex question that governments, insurers, and organizations are beginning to try to look at today. Now, one of the things that a lot of us have some concern on our own part is that very quickly we've seen large language models become owned by big tech. And this is largely because first of all, it's pretty clear that there is significant financial return to these if we learn to apply them correctly, but also because the computational power that's required by these is so enormous that it's just simply not in the reach of small organizations. It is in the reach of some universities, and we'll talk about how that evolves in the future. But with the kinds of models that we're seeing today that increasingly have investments by Microsoft and Google and Facebook and others, there's very little access to the underlying code or training data. And as a consequence, models may deliver bias or harmful behavior, and we don't understand fully why that's the case, because we don't understand how they were trained or how they absorbed the information that they did. And I think significantly, privacy impacts are not well understood and they're not well regulated. LLMs obviously harvest a lot of information and they regurgitate a lot of information, and there's not a lot of process or policy right now that would protect that information. Now, theoretically, we're working with fairly closed systems, but they obviously have inputs and outputs. And so there is something to be concerned about there. I think underlying the level of concern that many of us have is this feeling, and I speak as one, I suppose, in this instance, don't trust the techies. And I think you see this all around us, even among the core group of technologists that are formulating the AIs. Thus, this concern of an open letter recently released asking for a slowdown, which nobody really expected would be honored in the implementation of AI. So to give us time to understand what the consequences are. But this is a new revolutionary technology that we all do need to try to understand to some extent. Now, there are obvious concerns with these AIs about what the impacts are on our understanding of originality and copyright and law. I mean, there are fundamental questions like, is an LLM like ChatGPT a legal person in the same way that our law understands a ship or corporation to be? And I think that we're seeing initial guidance from the US Copyright Office, European Union, and other organizations, but we really don't understand these right now. And it's clear this is not a black and white dichotomy between human produced and machine produced, and there's tremendous gray area in between. And I think trying to understand that gray area is going to be very difficult for us. It's also important to understand that LLMs are not mechanistic in the sense that they're fully rules-based. They are predictive. They're not simple dictaphones absorbing information and spewing it back out that in a highly replicable fashion. And yet, as I've mentioned, their capabilities are not fully deducible. There's a lot of comparison right now between AIs and human language, because language is itself very adaptive. And we like to think that there are a lot of rules to any given language, but any user of English, which is a very sloppy language grammatically, understands that that's not the case. And AIs are like that too. Sapir, the very famous linguist, once wrote, "All grammars leak." And by that, he meant that there's a point at which our understanding of language is very predictive. And in a way, this is the kind of intelligence, put that in air quotes, I suppose, but the kind of intelligence that AIs are also bringing. Now, the title of this talk is The Future of Scholarly Communication in a ChatGPT World, and I have no idea. So at this point, I'm almost prone to break for questions, but I do want to try to make some conclusions and sort of reproduce some of the insights that others have provided to me and to others over the last few weeks as we've all tried to understand what's going on today. So I think if we talk about general trends, as we've discussed, there is a fundamental lack of understanding about how these things work. And that creates this motivation to continue to scale LLMs, to get to improve their capabilities. One of the core scientists and innovators behind AIs, Matt Friedman, said recently, there are kind of these big blobs of math and we don't actually know what's going on. And when someone like that, indicates that level of uncertainty, we know that we're going to have to respond in a way that's maybe not fully informed. AIs are also increasingly cloud-based, or they are currently cloud-based because of the level of computation that's required to generate them, but they are increasingly ubiquitous. We're seeing them downscaled, maybe with a loss of a little bit of precision, to move into mobile platforms like laptops and phones. And I think that will be increasingly the case. And there's obviously a trend to incorporate as much of these capabilities into silicon, into chips as possible, and Apple is, for one, been proceeding to do that. There's also a race to integrate AIs into every application that we have out there right now on the desktop. And I think that that's an understandable reflex, although we don't really understand what an appropriate user experience is for a lot of these applications. And I think that we'll have to be learning through our iteration, our learning through practice with that. It's really interesting right now, the way that ChatGPT and other LLMs are priced at a commercial level. It's actually not expensive to produce these kinds of integrations. And so an application like hypothesis annotation services can integrate an AI helper in a way that's not terribly expensive for them to bear. It'll be interesting to see how the pricing models, which are fractions of a cent at this point per token, how those evolve and what the ramifications of that evolution are. Now, I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of work going on in higher education with our own set of models to try to figure out how AIs work. And then in part, this is driven by wariness of commercialized AIs. So we are seeing the production of some truly open AIs in response. And we're beginning to try to play, the research university environment, beginning to try to play with LLMs scaled down, perhaps that have modifiable parameter sets or work at different sized models to see how those interactions play out. There's a lot of experimentation right now with fine-tuning LLMs and better understanding how output is generated in one situation or another. We're also beginning to see some play around the ingest of structured data for the optimization of parameters to assist in the predictive output of AIs. So, these kinds of AIs, they're not at this point, and perhaps in the future, not likely to be commercially competitive at the same level that something from OpenAI is at this point in time, but they do allow us a very interesting and very focused functionality that's very important. For now, AIs are everybody's new assistant. I think we're all playing with seeing how AIs can help us in our daily work. But one of the things that is also becoming quite clear is that there are some real employment threats, career threats, occupational threats to AIs and how they evolve and how they're rolled out to support work in the future. And so right now we're seeing what several commentators are calling computer-assisted humans, aiding our work processes, speeding up our ability to produce work. But it's not really clear what some of the longer ramifications of that will be. I think a really good comparable is photography, where in the realm of film-based imaging, we used to have a very good intimate understanding of aperture and shutter speeds and focal lengths and have an understanding of light and color. And now a huge proportion of that is captured within software at a level that we could never replicate it as a human. And so, I think one of the clear impacts of AIs is obviously going to be that portion of professional work that is repetitive or methodical, or that has clear pattern or rules-based logic to it. And so I think, I wanted to throw up just for a point of discussion or controversy, I would say it's pretty clear that some targets of AI deskilling are going to include some portions of programming, software engineering. Certainly the software engineers that I work with are both using GPT and other LLMs, such as Copilot from GitHub. And we're all commenting that this can take the place of some of the work that we do in engineering. Other areas that I think we're seeing early discussions of: medical diagnosis, particularly based on imaging or large amounts of textual input, paralegal drafting. There's a certain range of publication support functions like editorial support that we're seeing some discussion of right now, and certain types of librarian reference. Certainly not the work of librarians generally, but certainly, people are utilizing these conversational AIs in ways that do replicate in interesting ways the kinds of deep interactions we've historically had with reference librarians. It'll be interesting to see how we try to evolve with conversational AIs in the future. Now, one of my friends, Adam Hyde, the founder of Coco, in some discussions with Paul Shannon, who's the CTO of eLife, and John Chodacki of the California Digital Library, worked recently in a workshop in New Zealand trying to understand what a taxonomy of different kinds of AI functions might look like, particularly with a focus in publishing. And they arrived at this taxonomy. And I won't dive into each of these in too much detail for time's sake, but I think this is a useful way of looking at the kinds of interventions that AI can provide in a field like publishing, and helps us think through its consequences. So the categories that they thought of are extraction of entities or knowledge components from literature, validating information, generating, helping authors or editors generate text or images, analysis, interpreting information within a publication, reformatting, this is an area of real interest, enhancing a publication, doing spell checking, early work in OCR correction of imaged works. So that's, I think, something that we can apply at scale. Discovery, finding, linking, citation, information sources, and then what they broadly call translate or translation. And these are transforming, so changing the sentiment of a text or translating it to another language. These are increasingly accurate and are very rules-based. And I think as our understanding of how to compute translations has evolved, we'll see AIs get even better at these kinds of transformations in the future. So I really think it's nice to work with a taxonomy like this, because it does help channel our understanding as we approach our own workflows, as we approach our own businesses and our own work activities, how they might change or impact what we're doing. But with loss, there is gain. Obviously AIs are bringing us a lot of new insights, and we're all, I think, trying to figure out how we can do more faster and more better. And so we're certainly, as professionals in education and publishing and teaching and research, trying to figure out how that works. I think it's probably a truism that a lot of work will be easier and less routine. But as I alluded, maybe we'll have fewer jobs of the kinds that we have now. And new jobs will emerge, and we don't know what they will be like fully. I think one of the things that we can be concerned about with AIs is that the middle level of professional capacities may continue to erode. And I think a lot of societies globally, what we're seeing is a sort of dumbbell-shaped distribution where there are a lot of people that are occupied in relatively low skill requisite types of work. And then on the far side of the distribution, a number that are working with very complex attributes around knowledge or information, leaving this hollow in the middle. And one of the worries that I have is that AIs will continue to hollow out that social distribution and increase inequity. And that's something we need to be very careful about. I think that as we give AIs their credence, obviously AIs can do a lot of things that we can't already. I think that that's clear, that they can connect, summarize, and juxtapose information across a span of knowledge that we just don't have at in our capacity. I think one of the things that we'll see as that becomes ever more apparent is that we'll grant AIs more autonomy, and that the review of those functions will become ever more difficult. And so again, there's this real rush in research to understand with checkpoints, how are AIs working? How can we how can we keep up with AI so that we understand how they work and what they are providing us. I do think that the efforts to detect or label AI generated output versus human output are doomed to fail. I just cannot believe that we will construct patterns of imprinting AI output that will enable us with consistency to detect output from AIs versus human or co-produced output. So I can understand why there's an incentive to do this, but I just don't think it's going to be very effective in the long run. And I think that one of the other things that we'll start to see, and we are seeing now, obviously, as becoming increasingly likely that we can be snookered by AI output of images or texts or quotations or videos. You know, the boundaries between AIs and humans will become fuzzy in ways that we're not expecting right now. And it'll be really interesting to see how we struggle with that. So I'm beginning to wrap up here, and I just want to leave with a few higher level thoughts. One of the things that I think that we are understanding in a way that I think we did not predict. There's so many things we did not predict with AIs, is that we're developing a broader understanding of intelligence, and that intelligence isn't a single thing. It's not a single human thing, but there are different ways of having intelligence. James Bridle, an artist and thinker, a thought leader in the UK, I think has been particularly eloquent, sometimes very critical of AIs. And they've tried to understand how AIs may help us better understand different forms of intelligence. When I was putting this talk together, I remembered this quote in an early work in the early 70s of evolutionary biology by the wonderfully named authors Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox. And they had this quote in the work attempting to distinguish humans from other animals by saying only people plant flowers. And as I was looking up that quote, I stumbled on this other quote, just a couple sentences beyond, which I thought really reflected where we are with AIs. And they said, given an animal endowed with the biological capacity to produce and attach itself to symbols, we can confidently expect a range of bizarre outcomes. And so I certainly think that here we are with AIs trying to grapple with some of the bizarre outcomes that we've produced. And so, you know, this title of the talk, Aiding and Abetting, it's really critical that we keep a level understanding that we are the creators of these AIs and that they may have emergent capacities, but ultimately we are their manufacturers. We are making artificial intelligence, just as we make shovels or engines. And so we have some agency here, and we must continue to invoke that agency as we attempt to understand, to improve, and to shape the work that we do and our understanding and our improvement of our own societies. Again, referring back to Adam Hyde, who said casually in an email communication, maybe the process of the creation is less important than the outcome. And he's not referring here to things that we make with our hands, of course, but creative arts and work where we've long introduced different kinds of tools. And I think one of the struggles we have is to divorce ourselves from some of the angst that AIs are producing in us, understandably, and to grapple better with learning how we work with AIs and how we learn from AIs to do better in the world around us. And with that, I send you my thanks. It's my contact on Mastodon and my email, and I look forward to your questions and your thoughts. And back to you, Gary and Heather.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. That was wonderful. We have a lot of questions queued up for you. So
Excellent.
yeah, we can just dive in. So there's a couple of questions here that are on a similar topic, so I'm going to read them together. We have one from Laura that says, do these GPT models have the ability to circumvent the disinformation they encounter in these large amounts of information? And then Barbara Pope, what is being done to ensure the accuracy of the output of the AI?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of work to train AIs and to broaden the information to more diverse sets of information for AIs to focus on. And so with those iterations, there's hope that the amount of disinformation that they produce will diminish. This is an effort to introduce what are called guardrails around AI generally. And so that the amount of what we truly think of as biased or inaccurate information is reduced. But this is going to be a hard piece of work. And obviously, one of the things we struggled with is that the AIs that are predominant right now have been trained through the absorption of large amounts of general information. And with that, there's a lot of inaccurate or imprecise data. And so this is an area where human agency is very requisite. I think it's also interesting to note in higher education and in other knowledge intensive areas, we are starting to see more specialized AIs emerging. And I think that this trade-off between general purpose AIs and specialized AIs that might contain more accurate or more precision level information or data will be a very interesting one to watch. And it could be that general AIs over time, general LLMs, become precise enough that they are we rely on them for 95% of our work and only turn to specialized AIs in areas that they're the most critical, whether it's medical or financial or high precision engineering or mathematics. But that may not be the case. And so we may end up becoming reliant on highly trained, more focused AIs that reduce the amount of aberrant noise in their systems. And so, I think that's something we'll have to watch and see.
Thank you. So you touched on this a little bit when you spoke about how this technology is becoming more ubiquitous, but Caroline has a question. One of the biggest problems with cryptocurrency is the sheer volume of computing power needed to mine even part of a coin. Is there the same concern about these AI systems that also require increasingly vast amounts of computing power?
Yes, that's indeed the case. And, we don't see that sort of population of that computational load being created at the same global level as was the case with crypto algorithms. But the models do require intense computation, as I mentioned, and we're working with chipsets that are highly simple but incredibly fast, and they consume vast amounts of energy. Many of these chipsets from companies like NVIDIA and others that are producing specialized, historically graphics-oriented processing chips are capable of trillions of operations per second. And they're assembled into packages, and these packages of computation are reliant on a vast amount of energy. So I think as we get better at understanding how they're made, and perhaps with this tension that I just mentioned with specialized AIs versus general purpose AIs, we may see more efficient generation, and we may better understand the trade-offs in high precision, high scale versus smaller or lower precision models. But yes, this is yet another concern for climate.
Thank you. A question from Angie. She says, as leaders, how do we help employees and colleagues navigate upskilling and fear mitigation? Probably part of the the job replacement portion of the presentation?
I think that's a really important and thoughtful question. And I guess my first response would be, we can't hide this technology. I think it's really important to engage people who have some responsibility for how work is structured to start understanding it. So if you're in a position to play or work with these conversational models, you should. It's very instructive, far more instructive than reading about them. And as you start seeing how you can integrate these into your work and into your personal life, I think that is the only way really we can better understand how we can adjust our own work environments, our own occupations to adjust to AIs. So I think that's the single most critical thing to do. Get your hands on these technologies, touch them, understand them, and I think we need to start talking about what are the new areas that are being created for us to move into. You know, what are those new jobs? How can we complement the work that AI might replace with new sets of skills? And some of that will be upskilled, doing better more quickly, but I do think that we'll see different kinds of opportunities emerge.
Thank you. So here's an interesting question from Jennifer. Were you caught off guard as we lay people were with what appears to us as a sudden leap, or was it just us lay people who were caught off guard?
I think a lot of people have been caught off guard, and I was caught off guard. Yes, I think I was looking back. I was not ignorant that this work was proceeding. And I certainly was reading about some of the research that was being undertaken in AI modeling. I was certainly aware of last year's news with image generation, with Stability AI and DALL-E and others of that ilk. But I do think that it was just a slap of cold water when we saw the level of functionality of ChatGPT emerge, and also beginning to understand some of the capacities around emergence and the ease of integration and so forth. I do also think that OpenAI has been very smart, and its investors have been very smart in allowing easy integration through its APIs. It is remarkably easy to integrate these LLMs, these generative models, into applications. And I think that sudden burst of seeming ubiquity has also been part of that shockwave of functionality that we're seeing. So no one should feel unique or that they weren't paying attention. I think we've all been surprised.
Yes, I know I was. Thank you. Let's see here. So we have a question from Sanford Thatcher. What might the impact be on kinds of publishing that are formulaic, like genre fiction, romance novels? Could chatbots produce these just as humans do, following the rules of the genre?
The short answer, yes. And I guess the one caveat I would put there is that we've already seen that. There's already been a lot of work in certain genres that often consciously utilize modeled construction of their narratives and plots and characterization and conflicts. This is particularly true of romance and science fiction and fantasy. And there have been models that have been discussed for generating these texts, and some automation of them, as well as mining of them through text mining and machine learning to try to figure out, based on sort of user stats, so like who's reading a book through, how quickly, where do they pause, and what are the elements of story construction that lead to a captivating novel. So our understanding of certain types of fictional environments has already been enriched by working with machines and artificial intelligence to some extent. So I think we will definitely start to see, generation of both academic as well as fictional texts begin to emerge and with greater frequency. And I think it'll be an easier entry curve into fictional works that are genre-based than it will be in these other areas. And it'll be really interesting to see how quickly we can get to a point where they are at least as good as some of the current more high frequency produced volumes of literature in these areas.
Thank you. We have a number of questions related to trust. So I'm going to go through. The first one is anonymous. Can you think of a historical example where people had to learn to, quote, trust a technology, even if it wasn't perfect? I ask because I can't imagine leaving editing and OCR corrections solely to AI because of how imperfect the technology is. And it's hard to envision a world in which they are perfected.
So I will admit to some weakness of my history of technology here. I certainly, I think we can all appreciate the stresses that occurred in the shift from oral to written traditions and the disjuncture that caused, and how people understood the world and how they actually thought about the world in a cognition sense. And I think we've seen dramatic shifts in our understanding of the world and of the cosmos and our place in that have shaken people's beliefs and understanding at fundamental levels. But this level of machine engagement with what was heretofore, the sole domain of human activity, I think is novel, and we can accord it some respect with that novelty. And I hear your mistrust of it, and I think we all should have some mistrust of it. But my expectation would be that the level of fidelity and relatively rote or repetitive tasks is going to be quickly exceeding the error rate of humans. Right? We all fail, we all make mistakes, and I think very quickly machine-made mistakes will occur at a lower frequency in many of those tasks than we see today. And I think what will be curious and of concern is, are those mistakes different? Is their magnitude of significance different? And I think that's something that we'll have to monitor closely and be cognizant of.
Thank you. Related question from Regina. What are the attempts to develop laws such as Asimov's law of robotics to help prevent catastrophic risk?
There's been a lot of discussion around this area. People in some ways bemoan the lack of some kind of published set of covenants or principles. Whether or not one will emerge, I don't know. In some ways, I have to feel like the horses are well out of the barn at this point. But I think it may be at a juncture where we see some starkly negative impact, or a near high impact negative impact that we may have to craft that kind of covenant with AIs. But I just don't think, unfortunately, we understand what we've produced well enough to know what a good set of covenants might be. And so that's something that we'll need to be conscious of in the future also.
Thank you. Let's see here. We have a couple of questions about sources or lack thereof. Karen, I was frustrated by ChatGPT's lack of references or sources for its responses. Are there attempts to build into the system ways to include sources from which the assertions are being made? And RJ has a similar question. Where are most of the generic LLMs getting their data? I've heard that Reddit is a major source. Is this correct?
So on the first piece, yes, there's a number of efforts to provide provenance or citation in LLMs and chat models. There are AIs that provide this functionality as sort of a banner feature. And among others, I will hat tip to Gary, who I know is tracking this assiduously, and I'm sure he'll be speaking about that later on today or tomorrow. But there are AIs that do provide that provenance, like Perplexity. And I think we'll see a lot of that in some of the more focused AIs that are emerging in areas around, again, medicine or finance, anything that's knowledge intensive. So we have a lot of interest in academia around that area. Gary, did you want to throw in a couple references there, and then I'll respond with training set?
Well, you mentioned, thank you, Peter. You mentioned Perplexity. That is one that I have been playing with, and that does provide provenance in terms of open web sources, because that's crawling and using training using the open web. But another one that I just read about yesterday, I think there was a paper posted in Archive about it, and that goes to the specialty idea that you specialty databases, specialty ingest for different needs, is one from Bloomberg, who is creating one with financial data that Bloomberg is training to provide a chat-like interface for the massive amounts of data that they ingest.
Yeah, so I think we'll see a lot of interest in that in areas where that provenance or citation is particularly critical. In terms of training data, there's a vast amount of information that's available for Harvest Online. And so I think basically these models took what they could get. And, you know, we have seen some legal actions where corpora who feel like their content was protected or under licensing agreements, under licensing terms, have objected to the impression that they've garnered, that often with good reason, that their content has been harvested. Getty Images is the most famous of those. And there's certainly some speculation that open repositories of books and other materials have been harvested. You know, there are a number of open repositories of content online in academia, open libraries, open archives, and I would certainly expect all of those have been harvested. I think that we'll again see perhaps the emergence in some of these fields that we all touch on of the emergence of more focused AIs. You know, so there's a lot of interest and thought being given to what could we do if we harvested all of IA's texts or digitized text and focused on applications emerging from that. And I know the Internet Archive is very much thinking through those ramifications. HathiTrust, other large repositories are thinking about the capabilities, the opportunities, consequences, and of course we're all trying to understand, you know, what the legal issues are around harvesting, ingest, and model production. So yeah, if it's out there, it's been consumed.
Muted. Sorry. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time for this session. There are still several unanswered questions in the Q&A lineup there. Peter, I'm not sure if you have time afterwards to type out some answers for those, but if not, I'll copy paste them and send them to you. But thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of our attendees for your thoughtful questions. I'm going to turn things over now to Heather